The smell hit me before I even saw the smoke. Acrid, sharp, unmistakably wrong. I dropped the grocery bags on the porch and sprinted toward the door, heart pounding in my throat. Flames flickered behind the front window, and for a split second, time slowed. Somewhere inside that inferno was my wife, 8 months pregnant, who had texted me just 10 minutes ago to ask if I wanted lemonade with dinner. I could hear her then, faint but rising, a scream I'll never forget. I kicked at the door until it gave way and was instantly swallowed by heat. This wasn't an accident. The fire hadn't started in the kitchen or from faulty wires. No, someone had poured accelerant by the porch. The HOA had been on our backs for weeks, but I never imagined anyone would go this far. I was wrong, and if she lived, someone would have to answer for it. 3 months earlier, life had finally begun to settle into something that resembled peace. We had moved into the house just after New Year's, a quiet cul-de-sac in a manicured neighborhood with trimmed hedges and cheerful mailboxes. It was the kind of place people smiled while walking their dogs and waved at passing cars. My wife, Mia, was glowing with the kind of joy that came from new beginnings. Her pregnancy was healthy, the nursery was coming together, and for the first time in years, I wasn't looking over my shoulder or waking up to the sound of phantom gunfire. Retirement from the Navy had been harder than I'd expected, but she made it easier. She filled our home with music, painted the walls with pastel shades of hope, and convinced me that maybe I didn't need to be at war to feel useful. The first time we met Karen, it was over a welcome basket. She wore a bright blouse and a tight smile, standing at our door with a clipboard in one hand and a ceramic pie dish in the other. She asked polite questions, gave us the rundown of the HOA policies, and complimented Mia's growing belly with practiced warmth. Something about her felt rehearsed. I'd seen that kind of smile before, usually worn by officers who hid bad orders behind friendly tones. Mia didn't notice at first. She was just happy to be somewhere safe, where she could take evening walks without fear and talk to neighbors without suspicion. Then came the first notice, a letter about the trash can being visible from the street. It was folded neatly and slipped under our doormat. A week later, another one followed, this time about our porch light being too bright. Mia laughed it off. She said we'd just have to adjust, that some neighborhoods were more tightly wound than others. I nodded and let her believe that. But I had been watching. I saw how Karen's smile tightened each time she passed us. I noticed how she lingered too long when Mia parked crooked in the driveway. I heard the way her tone shifted from friendly to clipped during board meetings. There was something territorial about her, something brittle hiding beneath all that suburban cheer. And though I couldn't quite name it then, I already knew trouble was circling. It was during the spring planting that Karen dropped the mask. Mia had spent the morning in the front yard, kneeling in the flower beds with a small trowel in one hand, and her belly balanced carefully between her knees. The doctor had warned her not to overdo it, but she loved working with her hands, especially now that the baby was growing strong. She had planted a row of sunflowers along the walkway and filled the borders with pansies, lavender, and creeping thyme. Our mailbox, once grey and anonymous, had a wreath of ivy twining gently around its post. Karen showed up around noon with a phone in one hand and a printed pamphlet in the other. She didn't ask how Mia was feeling. She didn't compliment the flowers. She pointed to the mailbox and said it violated regulation, 12B of the neighborhood standards. Mia stood slowly and wiped the dirt from her palms. She offered to remove the ivy, even though it was harmless. Karen didn't smile. She leaned in and said that homeowners who started off ignoring the rules tended to be the ones who made trouble down the line. Mia blinked. Then she nodded and said she'd take care of it. I was watching from the living room window, coffee in hand. I hadn't heard the words, but I saw the body language. I saw the way Karen gestured, sharp and clipped, and how Mia's posture stiffened as she folded her hands over her stomach. Later that evening, when I asked her about it, Mia waved it off and said not to worry. She said Karen just had a lot on her plate. I didn't believe that, but I didn't push. The next few weeks felt like a slow unraveling. Karen began walking past our house more often, sometimes twice in the same morning. She would pause by our yard, sometimes scribbling something in a notebook or taking pictures with her phone. We received notices for things that made no sense. The height of the grass, a wind chime that was too loud, a complaint about peeling paint on a fence that had been newly stained. Mia started to cry at night, overwhelmed by it all. She didn't want to fight, didn't want stress to affect the baby, so she tried to comply. She took down the chime. She stopped gardening out front. She kept the curtains drawn during the day. But submission only fed Karen's sense of control. When I tried to confront her, she accused me of aggression and warned she would call the board. She smiled when she said it, a tight, satisfied thing like she'd finally won something. That was when I realized this wasn't about rules. It was about power. And my wife, kind and trusting, had become a target. It escalated faster than I expected. One morning, I found a bright orange violation notice taped to our front door like a scarlet letter. It said our mailbox still failed to meet aesthetic guidelines. This was after Mia had already stripped the ivy, repainted the post, and replaced the box with a standard model we'd bought at the hardware store. The notice included a fine, $50, due within 10 days. It was petty, but Mia insisted we pay it. She didn't want confrontation. She said maybe if we just gave in, it would stop. I knew better. Submission didn't dissolve this kind of control. It fed it. But I let her handle it her way. For a while, because she was trying so hard to keep peace. And because the baby was due in less than 2 months, and the last thing I wanted was to bring more stress into our home. So we mailed the check. I went about reinforcing the fence and finishing the nursery, while Karen circled like a vulture. Then came the accusation about our trash bins. She filed a report saying we were leaving them out overnight. We weren't. I double-checked every week. I took them to the curb Wednesday mornings and hauled them back by that same afternoon. But now we were being fined again. $100 this time. I asked for proof. Karen refused. She cited witness testimony. No names, no photos, no hearing. Mia started flinching every time she saw an envelope in the mail with the HOA letterhead. Her blood pressure rose. She was told to stay in bed for a few days and rest. I took over more of the errands, tried to make her laugh with stories from my Navy days, tried to drown out the pressure building around us like a vice. But Karen wasn't finished. A week later, while I was at the store picking up prenatal vitamins and groceries, Mia called me crying. Karen had come to the door with 2 other board members, one holding a phone like they were filming, the other scribbling on a clipboard. They said our holiday lights were still up. It was a string of white bulbs around the back porch that Mia had forgotten to take down after New Year's. She tried to explain. They said she was creating a nuisance and lowering property values. Mia said they stood too close, wouldn't let her shut the door until she agreed to remove them immediately. She had started trembling, hand gripping the side of her belly, tears spilling down her cheeks. I got home 10 minutes later. They were gone, of course. I reviewed the security footage. No audio, just Karen's face smirking into the camera as she backed away down our driveway. I still don't know what they said in full, but that day changed something in Mia. She stopped sitting in the sunroom. She started locking the doors even when I was home. She jumped at night noises. And still, she didn't want me to fight it. She kept saying it would pass, that maybe once the baby was born they'd back off. I couldn't explain to her that people like Karen don't back off. They press harder until they feel you break. And they especially hate people they can't control. Mia was kind, generous, vulnerable. But she wasn't weak. And Karen didn't know how to handle that. It chipped away at her little empire of rules and threats. It made her angry. One night, I came home to find chalk on the driveway. A message scrawled in bold, jagged letters. Leave. Another time, someone poured what smelled like bleach over the front lawn. The grass went yellow within days. I filed complaints. They disappeared. The HOA said there was no evidence, no responsibility, that perhaps neighborhood children were to blame. We stopped sleeping well. Mia curled in beside me each night, but I could feel the tension in her body, the way she started at the creak of the house settling or the slam of a distant car door. I began keeping a bat beside the bed. Not because I expected burglars, but because I no longer trusted what our own neighbors were capable of. I wanted to believe that reason would win out. That if we just held on, Karen would get bored or distracted. But each time I saw her patrolling the sidewalk, each time I saw her watching our windows, I knew we were running out of time. Something in her eyes had changed. It wasn't just about power anymore. It was about punishment. And my wife had become the object of that obsession. Mia went into early labor scare the night before it happened. She had woken me with a sharp cry, clutching her side as she sat upright in bed. Her breathing was shallow, her hands trembling. I helped her down to the living room couch, rubbed her back, and called the doctor. They told us to monitor her, that it might just be Braxton Hicks, that stress could bring on all kinds of false alarms. She fell asleep in my arms that night, her body finally relaxing after an hour of slow breathing and whispered reassurances. I stayed awake, listening to the wind against the windows and watching the shadows move across the walls. Something didn't sit right. It hadn't for weeks. The tension had turned into a low, constant hum under my skin. The next day, Mia insisted I go to the store. We were low on groceries, and she wanted to make soup. Something about the normalcy of it calmed her. I didn't want to leave, but she kissed me on the cheek and told me she'd be fine. The sun was out. The sky was clear. Nothing about the day looked dangerous. I made the mistake of believing that meant we were safe. As I pulled out of the driveway, I noticed Karen standing across the street. She was speaking to someone I didn't recognize, a man in a blue windbreaker, gesturing toward our house like it was a crime scene. I made a note to ask Mia if she'd seen him before, but I kept driving. The store was only 15 minutes away. I moved fast, grabbing the items on her list and heading to self-checkout. I was bagging the last of the groceries when my phone buzzed. It was a text from Mia. "Smells like gas. You turn off the stove?" I stared at it, heart already lurching. I hadn't used the stove. She hadn't either. I called her. No answer. Called again. Still nothing. I ran. By the time I pulled back into the neighborhood, I could see smoke in the sky, a grey-black spiral rising above the rooftops. I floored the accelerator. Our lawn was empty. No fire trucks. No neighbors. Just silence, broken by the roar of flame through shattered windows. The front porch was glowing orange, and somewhere behind all that, I could hear her. Faint, hoarse, screaming my name. I didn't think. I moved. I kicked the door in and felt the heat swallow me whole. The fire surged like a living thing, roaring with a sound that shook the walls. Smoke coiled thick and black through the entryway, wrapping itself around my throat and eyes. I dropped low to the floor, arm across my mouth, heart hammering as I called out for Mia. I couldn't hear her voice anymore, only the cracking of beams and the hiss of something collapsing deeper inside the house. I crawled through the heat, guided by muscle memory more than vision. The hallway was half obscured, smoke billowing from the kitchen and licking down the walls like paint melting in slow motion. I knew where she would be. If she had moved at all, it would have been toward the nursery, toward the safest part of the house. The irony was sickening. That safe place had become a trap, and the fire was closing in on it. A groan came from above as part of the ceiling sagged. I pushed forward, hand scraping across floorboards that burned even through my sleeves. My lungs screamed, my eyes blurred. I felt the sting of heat eating through the fabric on my arms, and then, through the smoke, I heard her. Weak, rasping, but real. She was calling for me. I reached the nursery door and forced it open with my shoulder. The room was hazy, full of heat and smoke, but not yet fully engulfed. Mia was curled near the crib, trying to shield her belly with her arms. Her face was streaked with soot, her eyes wide with panic and relief when she saw me. I crossed the room in 2 strides and pulled her up. Her legs buckled, but she clung to my arm. "I couldn't move," she whispered, coughing. It was everywhere. "I've got you," I told her, voice low and steady, even though fear was clawing at the edges of my mind. "We're getting out." I lifted her, one arm under her legs, the other braced across her shoulders. The weight wasn't the issue. It was the path back. The living room was gone, the fire pouring through the collapsed front window like a wall of liquid heat. The hallway behind us was beginning to smoke over again. I turned toward the back of the house, kicking through the laundry room door and bursting out onto the patio. The air hit my face like salvation, cool and sharp, and I kept moving until we reached the fence. I set Mia down just long enough to hoist her over the gate, then climbed after her. The neighbors were just starting to gather now, emerging from their homes with cautious steps and cell phones in hand. No one had called for help yet. I could see it in their faces. Fear, guilt, hesitation. Karen stood at the edge of her lawn, arms crossed over her chest, eyes locked on us. She didn't look surprised. She looked annoyed, like we had inconvenienced her. I saw a flicker of something in her hand. A lighter. She slid it into her pocket as I stared at her. The fire trucks arrived 7 minutes later. By then, Mia was lying on the grass, skin blistered across one arm and her left leg, coughing up black phlegm while I knelt beside her, my own hands shaking. The medics rushed in, shouting, pulling oxygen masks from their kits and checking her pulse. They asked if she was pregnant. I said yes. I said it twice. They moved faster. The flames swallowed our roof while they worked. Wood cracked and glass burst like gunfire. I couldn't stop watching Karen. She didn't move. She didn't flinch. She just stood there, eyes cold, face blank. It wasn't negligence. It wasn't some sick coincidence. It was intent. I could see it in the way she never once looked at Mia, not even as the sirens wailed and the fire climbed toward the sky. That was the moment I stopped thinking like a husband and started thinking like what I had been trained to be, not because I wanted revenge, but because this wasn't over. And Karen had just made the worst mistake of her life. I stayed with Mia at the hospital until they wheeled her into surgery. Her burns weren't the worst they'd ever seen, but they were deep enough to need skin grafts. Her left arm was covered in blistered layers, and her thigh had been scorched when she tried to shield herself from the heat. She'd inhaled too much smoke. They said the baby's heartbeat was still strong, but they couldn't guarantee anything. I sat in that plastic chair outside the operating room with my hands blackened from soot and my shirt still stinking of fire. The nurses offered to clean me up. I told them I wasn't going anywhere until she was out. 3 hours later, the doctor told me she'd made it through. They were monitoring the baby closely. There had been some distress, but the heartbeat remained stable. She was sedated, resting. I thanked him. Then I stood up and walked to the bathroom. I washed my face in the sink, watched the soot swirl down the drain, and stared at myself in the mirror. My hands were shaking. My jaw felt tight enough to crack. I breathed slowly, counted down from 10, and remembered everything I had ever learned about clarity under pressure. Karen had lit the fire. I didn't need her to confess. I didn't need her to leave fingerprints. She had stood there watching. She had pocketed the lighter. She had made no effort to help, no call for emergency services, no expression of shock or horror. She had watched my wife burn and turned her back. It wasn't carelessness. It was a statement. And now she was going to face consequences she couldn't control. I drove home in silence. The house was surrounded by yellow tape. A few officers were still on scene, walking through the remains, taking photographs and samples. I identified myself. I kept my tone level. I gave my statement without speculation. When they asked who I suspected, I gave them the facts. I told them about the lighter. I mentioned the long history of harassment, the documented fines, the letters, the security footage. I showed them the video from my door camera. Karen, standing across the street, watching the fire start, making no move. They took it seriously, but seriously was slow. Procedure required interviews, warrants, forensic testing. They said it could take weeks to build a case. I nodded. I thanked them. But I didn't wait. That night I put on my old boots. I pulled the long case from the back of the closet, the one I hadn't opened since leaving the teams. No weapons, just gear, tactical light, gloves, a phone loaded with surveillance apps. I wasn't looking to hurt her. I was looking to end this the way I knew how, with precision, with control, with undeniable proof. Karen's house was dark by midnight. Her lights were off, her curtains drawn. I circled the property once, staying low, mapping it out. She had cameras. I expected that. I knew where the blind spots were. I had installed the same models overseas. I used her own fence for cover and placed a motion-triggered recorder under the corner eave where her porch met the garage. Then I left. The next night, I returned. This time, I carried a small camera drone. Quiet, no larger than my palm. I launched it from the shadows of the neighbor's yard and guided it up through her second-floor window, slightly cracked for ventilation. It hovered in her hallway, unseen. I watched her walk into the study, phone in hand. I recorded the conversation. She spoke to someone I didn't recognize. She said it clearly, that the fire had been meant to scare us, that she hadn't known Mia would be home, that it was our fault for pushing her, for defying the HOA's order. She laughed. Said maybe now people would start respecting the rules again. I had what I needed. I sent the footage to the detective handling our case. I didn't wait for a reply. I knew the kind of evidence it was. The next morning, Karen was arrested in her driveway. No words. Just cuffs and a stunned silence from the neighbors who watched it happen. She looked up once as they put her in the car, and for the first time, her face cracked. She wasn't smug. She wasn't righteous. She was afraid, and I wanted her to feel it. Because justice wasn't a form. It wasn't a letter. It was knowing that no matter how safe you feel behind your fences and rules, there's always someone watching who knows exactly how to bring you down. The arraignment was quiet. Karen stood before the judge in a blazer 2 sizes too large, her hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. Her lawyer spoke on her behalf. She didn't speak. She didn't look at me. The prosecution played the audio from the drone, clear as crystal, Karen's own voice spelling out her intent. Her defense tried to argue context, said she had been venting, that it wasn't a confession, that she hadn't meant harm. But the judge didn't need much. The evidence was overwhelming, the timeline damning. She was denied bail. Word spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. People who had smiled at her for years now avoided her name. A few came to Mia's hospital room with flowers and awkward apologies. They said they never thought it would go that far. They said they hadn't realized how bad it was. I nodded and said nothing. Mia smiled politely, but I could see it in her eyes. She didn't believe them either. Karen's house went dark. The HOA released a statement claiming shock and disappointment. They said Karen had acted alone, that her actions didn't reflect the values of the board. I found the letter in our mailbox the day after her arrest, typed and stamped with a seal like it made things better. Mia tore it up without reading past the first line. I was called to testify. I sat in court and told the jury about the weeks of harassment, the threats disguised as notices, the chalk on the driveway, the bleach on the lawn. I described the fire, the smoke, the sound of Mia's voice behind the walls. I kept my voice even. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I let the silence between my words do the work. When I finished, the courtroom was still. Karen's lawyer asked me about my past. He tried to paint me as aggressive, said my military background made me prone to confrontation. The judge shut it down fast. The facts were too solid. The story too clean. The verdict came after 2 hours of deliberation. Guilty on all counts. Arson, attempted murder, reckless endangerment of a pregnant woman. Karen's sentence would follow, but for now, she was gone. A cell waited for her, and the home she'd tried to rule had already begun to erase her. I didn't celebrate. I drove back to the hospital and sat beside Mia, who was sleeping peacefully for the first time in days. I brushed the hair from her forehead and kissed her hand. The machines beside her blinked steady green. The baby's monitor pulsed in rhythm. Life had been nearly taken from us, but it hadn't won. Not this time. The hospital room was dim and quiet, lit only by the soft blue glow of the monitors. Mia's bandages had been changed that morning. Her arm was propped on a cushion, her leg wrapped and elevated. The burns looked worse than they felt, she told me. Her voice was hoarse but steady, her eyes calm behind the layers of exhaustion. I sat beside her every hour I was allowed, feeding her ice chips, helping her sip water, pressing her call button when the pain pushed too high. She never complained. Not once. She asked about the house. She asked about the baby. She never asked about Karen. When the obstetrician came in, we held our breath together. The baby's heartbeat was strong. No sign of distress. They wanted to monitor for a few more days just to be sure. Mia closed her eyes and smiled when she heard the soft thump of the Doppler. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. We were still whole. They moved her out of ICU after 5 days, into a quieter room, one with a window that looked out at a small courtyard. There was a tree out there, scraggly and wind-bent, but the leaves were green. She liked that tree, said it reminded her that life didn't have to be perfect to keep growing. People sent cards. Some came from neighbors we barely knew, signed with names we'd never heard spoken aloud. Most didn't mention what had happened. They said things like wishing you peace and thinking of your family. It wasn't enough, but it didn't matter anymore. Mia had survived. Our daughter was still safe. That was the only truth that carried weight. One night, I sat by her bed with my hand resting on her stomach. She was asleep, the slow rise and fall of her breathing in time with the beeping monitors. I could feel a tiny movement under my palm. A nudge, a flutter. The first time I'd really felt her. Our daughter, alive and fighting, just like her mother. The fire had tried to take them both, but it had failed. And all the rules, all the threats, all the poisoned letters in the world couldn't change that. We were still here. Scarred, yes, but here, and that was more than enough. 3 months later, our daughter was born on a quiet Wednesday morning. The delivery was long, but steady. Mia gripped my hand through every contraction, her face pale and focused, her body doing what it had been built to do. When the baby finally arrived, she came into the world red-faced and wailing, lungs full of strength. The doctors placed her on Mia's chest, and for a moment, everything else disappeared. The smell of smoke, the sting of heat, the nights spent wondering what might have been, all of it fell away as our daughter opened her eyes for the first time. We named her Elara. Mia said the name came to her in a dream. I didn't ask questions. It sounded like light. We moved to a new home a few weeks later, far from any HOA, on a stretch of wooded land with no neighbors close enough to knock on the door. It wasn't flashy. It didn't need to be. The silence was what we'd wanted. The safety. We rebuilt slowly. Each room a new chapter. Each day without fear a small kind of miracle. Karen was sentenced to 25 years without parole. I didn't go to the final hearing. I had already seen enough. She would live behind locked doors, surrounded by rules she didn't control, watched by people who didn't care how loudly she spoke. I didn't need to see her face again to feel peace. I had it already. Right there in the quiet rustle of Elara's breath as she slept against my chest. Sometimes Mia asks me if I still think about what happened. I tell her the truth. I do. Not every day, but often enough. I remember the fire. I remember the sound of her voice fading behind the smoke. But I also remember what came after. I remember her hand in mine, her strength, the way she never once asked for revenge, only that we move forward. We live simply now. I fix things. I grow vegetables. Mia teaches Elara to laugh. And on some nights, when the wind picks up and the house is still, I sit on the porch and watch the trees bend. Not breaking, just bending. Like that small courtyard tree outside the hospital window. Quiet, stubborn, alive, just like us.